Okay, so we are ready to go now, and I'm just going to start. You'll excuse my French. Have you heard FOFA yet? Um, it's a phrase that's being used a lot in this administration, being used by Stephen Miller, being used certainly in right-wing media ecosystems. Fuck around and find out, right? And I'm going to frame the week that starts with the invasion of Venezuela and ends not just with Renee Good executed in her car in Minneapolis, but with the administration saying things that are tendentious at best or obvious lies about her being a domestic terrorist, about her weaponizing her vehicle, etc. Um, that this is an effort to say to the country, Donald Trump is an unpopular president. He's in many respects a failure in terms of his policy, but he has the power. He has the capacity to exercise violence, and he is, right, absolutely willing, unrestrained in doing so. And so you may think of him as weakened by these new circumstances. Go ahead, try him, and this is what will happen to you. And I want to tie this to what I'm going to use the fancy political theory words, a political ontology. That is to say, a sense of how politics works at its most fundamental level. And this is being referred to within, in particular, the national security strategy that we spoke about together last week as flexible realism. But I think that is a misnomer. I think, as a matter of fact, for instance, John Mearsheimer, the great realist political scientist, I don't really like him, but I have to respect him, is saying, look, what Trump did in Venezuela is not realism. Realism says that the powerful will do what they can and the weak will suffer what they must, in Thucydides' famous formulation. But that, more than that, the powerful do what they can against a backdrop of a realistic calculation of power and its limits, its right balance. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think what Trump did in Venezuela was not a effort to either demonstrate power or to rebalance power. I don't think, frankly, it was that well thought through. And I think we see this in the aftermath of the invasion, in the press conference, and the idea that there'll be boots on the ground, Marco Rubio walking that back. I don't think there was a coherent long-term strategy that accompanied the invasion of Venezuela. I think, quite to the contrary, that the invasion of Venezuela was the goal. And that the reason that Venezuela was invaded was not to ultimately secure oil. Yes, that may have been top of the mind for Donald Trump, as it appeared obvious in that press conference and as the right accounts of the deliberations leading up to the invasion increasingly reveal. But was there a plan? Right. And I'll say this very quickly, right? We're beginning to see this with the oil executives having come to the White House yesterday, right? The oil reserves of Venezuela are probably highly exaggerated because it includes a lot of heavy, highly viscous oil that is very difficult to extract and refine, that the break-even point of doing so would be a price per barrel of oil much higher than it is right now, and $80 is a barrel as opposed to $60 a barrel where we are right now, that the oil industry knows this and is not eager to invest in extracting this oil. But also, the other aspect of break even on this proposition is Venezuela has to remain stable for long enough for the return on investment in infrastructure to pay out. And the oil executives are looking at the same stuff we looked at together last week, right? That there seem to be good signs that this regime is highly fragile and fractured, the regime in Venezuela, and there's no guarantee, that stable conditions will be in place long enough for them to be able to get that return, right? And so the point of the invasion of Venezuela, I think the fundamental point was to say, we, the United States, will do what we want with our power. The era in which the United States either does or at least pretends to abide by international norms, to be restrained by international institutions and laws, to respect and build alliances, and then to act only in ways that are acceptable to our allies is over, right? We are in charge of our hemisphere, and we will do what we want to here. The deed makes it so, right? And it makes it so in part because it shows that these institutions are incapable of restraining us, in part because in and of itself, the deed damages the institutions, and in part because we live in a world of viral images. And instead of seeing Maduro dancing at a rally, or dominating and repressing his people, what we now see is American helicopters and bombs flying through the air and destroying the military infrastructure of Venezuela, and President Nicolás Maduro in shackles being accompanied by American law enforcement agents into, a hearing that he's been abducted or renditioned to attend, right? And so the idea that we live in a world governed by norms, governed by rules, governed by institutions, I think is being attacked by the Trump administration. It's being attacked at the international level through the invasion of Venezuela. And by the way, it's being attacked at the domestic level. And I think, we can say we will get into the idea that the public execution of Renee Good is clearly illegal, clearly a violation of her civil rights and abuse of power, the kind of reprehensible, awful, vile thing that people like Maduro do to their citizens, and that we hope that the United States is better than. And that, again, the purpose of this, and I don't want to suggest that this is calculated, in the way that I do believe the invasion of Venezuela was, to produce an image, but that the way in which ICE is being deployed, the way in which federal law enforcement, whether it's immigration customs enforcement or border control or other kindred agencies, are being recruited, and the lack of training, and frankly, the use of agents who are not at all prepared to do crowd control or to manage protesters, that this is inviting exactly what happened on Wednesday, and that it's not, as far as the administration is concerned, a bad or regrettable thing that had happened. I think one of the remarkable things that surrounds the last 5 days of discourse around the killing of Renee Good is the lack of regret, the lack of contrition, the lack of empathy on the part of the administration, because again, right, this is an effort to now produce an image, a interpretation of that image, which says, fuck around and find out. This is the way this administration acts, and now you know. And so don't be surprised. If you think of this president as weak, as diminished, as unpopular, as lawless, and now being subjected to the rule of law, think again, right? Trump uses images of power to replace the limits of the rule of law and wants to do so with militarized violence at home as well as abroad. I think that that is what is coming into focus. And this is why, despite the fact that Donald Trump is diminished in terms of his popularity, in terms of his standing, in terms of his capacity to do what he was elected to do, to make the economy work better for most of us, and in terms of his perceived competence to do that, this is not, right, game over. This is not a president or an administration who will change course. This is, I think, the next phase, the next iteration of the Trump administration. I have on the board, and I'm sorry to hit you so hard, but I think that it's necessary to deal with the grim reality of the politics of the last few days. I have on the board not only, right, the images of Maduro in shackles, the images, and I'm sorry for providing a single still image of an incident that was recorded from multiple vantages, but I will argue in a moment or two the evidence of our eyes, right, the plain evidence of the recording when viewed appropriately from the multiple perspectives from which it can be viewed, is that this woman, who was gunned down by the man whose legs we see here, was no threat. She was no domestic terrorist. She had not weaponized her vehicle. She was parked, right, when these agents approached her. She rolled down her window and talked to them and said, I'm not angry. Go past me. Let me get out of your way. She gestured the vehicles around her and they moved around her. And then she attempted to execute a simple 3-point turn maneuver to get her vehicle out of the way. The man who shot her did not, in fact, lie in the path of her vehicle, as far as I can tell. And what I can see quite plainly with my own eyes is that he moved toward her vehicle as it moved forward. He did not get out of its way as if he felt some sense of imminent danger. He stepped toward her vehicle and over her hood to point his gun and to shoot her. Right? And then when she went past him, right, he's next to her, he shot 2 more times. Now, I will say this clearly. There are multiple angles. There's some interpretation here, and that it would be really very valuable if there were a legal proceeding in which forensic experts could come in and analyze this information and cross-question, right, witnesses and the officer who fired the shots and the other officers, and we could establish some common public record as opposed to having to rely on videos shot by bystanders and the way in which they circulate on the web and the way in which they're analyzed by our news organizations and other law enforcement officers, that's not the way to establish the truth of what is ultimately a legal matter. Was this a justifiable use of force by a law enforcement agent, or was this, in the way that I'm suggesting through the comparison images, more like the public execution, the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin in exactly the same city, close by, 5 years earlier, right? And I have on the board not only the images of George Floyd being killed and, right, Renee Good about to be killed, but also of the aftermath of these events. And for two reasons. I think it's predictive of where we may likely be going. Right before, right, a moment ago, I was hearing the report of protests in Philadelphia, and the protests are occurring throughout the country. And I think there's a good likelihood that these will not be, as the No Kings protests have been, intermittent protests, but maybe closer to the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer of 2020. That is to say, sustained, large-scale, spreading protests. And then I have, of course, Kyle Rittenhouse, right, who at the time was a vigilante kid with an assault rifle, but who now could very well be an ICE officer, right? And I do have to say, we know that when Donald Trump was in the White House in 2020, right, he wanted to deploy the military to put down the Black Lives Matter protests, and he wanted the military to use potentially lethal force, live bullets, shoot the protesters in the knees, as he said, right? And so again, I think we have to worry deeply about the danger of this moment. This is what I want to speak with you about today, and I will do so in a couple of different regards. I'm sorry, I know this is bleak, I know this is dark, but I think it's important that we be eyes wide open, that we think about it clearly, and that we figure out what we need to do about it as we, right, confront what seems to be happening. And so the first idea, the execution of an American citizen, the public killing of someone who was there to witness and record, distills the violent lawlessness of the deportation policies. I put deportation in scare quotes because I don't think it's about deportation primarily. And I've said this to you before. I think if Immigration, Customs Enforcement, Border Patrol, FBI, kindred agencies were targeting criminals in our midst, cartel members, drug dealers, people who engage in human trafficking or run prostitution rings. And I want to be clear. I do think there are those people in our midst, and I do think some of them are undocumented and come to this country precisely to participate in criminal activity in ways that is immoral and damaging to all of us. If that's what these federal law enforcement agents were targeting, I think they would have the support of local officials, local police, local communities. That's not what they're doing, right? Minimally, what they're doing is removing, extracting from our communities people who work hard, provide essential services, are law-abiding, and are, right, actually contributing to our society, and whose only crime is to have responded to the need of the American economy for their labor and come to the country illegally, right? And so, right, this is not really about going after criminals. That's rhetoric. I don't think it's really simply about deportation. I think it's about showing force, violence, power to blue cities, saying, we are in charge and we have the paramilitary organization to impose our will on you. And if you don't comply, this is what's going to happen to you. I've used the framing before that I like, which is that this is a battle between repression and resistance. And unfortunately, in these battles, right, the degree to which resistance is successful will, in the short term at least, increase the perceived need on the part of those who favor repression to increase repression. And I do think that's what we're seeing. And so there have been multiple incidents in which these federal law enforcement officers have shot at people and, right, injured and killed people in vehicles, right? At least 7 people have been shot in their vehicles since September. This is not an isolated incident. This is just the incident that I think is best captured, most egregious, and most likely to spread virally, right? The administration's narrative, right, that Renee Good is a domestic terrorist, that she weaponized her vehicle, that the officer in question was hit and injured and treated, right? We see him walking around the scene without any visible sign of injury immediately afterward. We hear him talking, etc. There does not appear to be any injury, but more importantly, I think there doesn't appear to be not only any collision, right? He's not hit by the car as far as we can make out, but right, to the extent that there is, right, any interaction here, it's one in which he is aggressive, not fearful, right? And so the entire narrative seems to be contradicted by the plain truth of the videos and the detailed analysis that the videos have been subject to now. And so the administration is asking us to ignore the evidence of our own eyes, and that is, right, a standard authoritarian tactic. And by the way, again, I want to be as clear as possible. It is trying to produce an image, to produce a truth. And that truth is, in a sense, right, whoever we say is a domestic terrorist is a domestic terrorist, right? And we have the power to shield the people who treat them thus, who call them thus, who label them in this way, from any kind of legal accountability for what they're doing. So the I think most urgent political question right now is, how widely will the protest spread? What will the administration's reaction be if large, sustained protests develop nationwide? And as I've already said, I think we are on the cusp of a dangerous situation in which this administration will be sorely tempted to react with further violence against, right, let us hope, peaceful protests, but especially if the protests spread and spiral out of control. And there's a good likelihood that that will happen, right? We're in the era of, right, protests that are organized via social media, not via social movements. And so the degree of discipline, training, cohesion, restraint that we saw in the civil rights movement, when organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were highly disciplined and trained, is not there in, right, America in 2026. And so the common theme, again, right, it's not just that the president has no respect for the legal limits on his office, likes military power, and is, or militarized power, and is desperate to display efficacy at a moment when he's increasingly perceived to be incompetent, weak, ineffective. It is that he believes he can produce the truth of power through the display, the imagery, the theater of power. And if you're hearing, right, echoes of, on the one hand, fascist and totalitarian theory from the early 20th century, and on the other hand, the right post-communist rise of 21st century autocracy in Eastern Europe, I think that's exactly right. And I don't think it's accidental. I do think that this is, in a sense, where Project 2025, where Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, etc., draw their inspiration from. And by the way, I think Donald Trump intuitively understands this dynamic very well. He is a person who thinks about brand and thinks about himself as a brand, and he thinks about that brand as fundamentally being one of power. And he's trying to produce the images that secure that power. I will say very quickly, I am highly skeptical of the idea that there will be legal accountability for what happened in Minneapolis. And right, I believe I have on the board here, yes, the idea that the headline, Minnesota officials say they're being blocked from investigating the ICE shooting. And just to state this clearly, right, it's going to be very difficult for state or local officials to indict the officer or officers involved if the federal government does not cooperate, because they will not have the physical evidence available to them. They will not have Renee Good's car. They will not have the casings to demonstrate which weapon it came from, the fingerprints on the gun. They will not have the testimony of the law enforcement officers. It's possible that either a criminal or a civil case can proceed at the state or local level, but it's much less likely unless, right, the FBI, the Department of Justice cooperate. And here I have to say I'm deeply skeptical of the idea that they could. So let us just consider for a moment, right, the possibility that this will happen. And note, right, that the ICE agents don't actually have blanket immunity from prosecution. They do have broad legal protections when acting in the scope of their official duties, and I do believe, right, that this would be a case where they're acting in the scope of their official duties. They're out on a mission. But according to Department of Homeland Security policy, right, law enforcement officers can use deadly force when they have a reasonable belief that the subject of such force poses an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to them or another person. And here, this is where having a trial, having experts, having, right, some capacity to establish a kind of common truth would be extraordinarily important, right? Is there any reasonable ground for the person who fired the shots to believe that he is in harm's way? I have reached my judgment on this, but I have to immediately acknowledge that I'm doing so in an amateur way, relying on publicly available footage. It would be much better if we could do this in a way that establishes at least a common legal outcome, right? Something that we can say, well, I may not think it's the truth and the whole truth, but at least justice has been done here. The federal prosecution, however, depends on the Department of Justice finding proof that the officers knew their conduct was unlawful or acted with reckless disregard for constitutional limits. That's a high bar. But it's not just a high bar because the legal standard is high. It's also a high bar because we have to believe that the Department of Justice would conduct an open, honest, searching, impartial investigation. And given how partisan and how corrupted the Department of Justice has become, right? Yet another, right, state attorney general, the attorney generals on the part of the Justice Department at the state level has been disqualified by a judge as having been inappropriately appointed this week, right? And the evidence keeps coming out that the Department of Justice has been weaponized for partisan purposes, to work at the whim of the president, and not as an impartial organization to enforce the rule of law. And so I don't believe I would be astounded. It would be an incredibly pleasant surprise if the Department of Justice actually conducted an impartial investigation and actually brought charges against the officer involved. So let me stop in terms of speculation about what I don't think is very likely, which is some sort of legal prosecution, and then notice, and this is where I want to spend a little bit of time today, that this is, of course, not a unprecedented situation, right? A person in a vehicle being shot by a law enforcement officer. As a matter of fact, it happens dozens of times a year, hundreds of times we've documented in the last decade, and typically the people in question are not white women, right, in the way that Renee Good was, a seemingly a law-abiding, upstanding person, a mother of three, a very sympathetic character. Please note, immediately Fox News identified her as a lesbian and indicated that she listed her pronouns in her website in an effort to, blunt any sympathy or identification that its viewers might have with her, right? To suggest, in other words, don't worry, she's not one of you. You don't have to worry about ICE coming for you. But having said that, right, the people who typically find themselves in harm's way behind the wheel are African American. And I say this because it seems to me, right, that Hannah Arendt wrote about a boomerang that works internationally as well as domestically, in which, right, the violence that is done to a group that is understood as an other, as a them, as opposed to us, whether that's violence against those in another continent, right, through colonialism, or violence against a domestic minority, whether that's Jews or a subnational group, an ethnic group that doesn't belong, or African Americans, right? Arendt was writing about the buildup to World War II. I'm thinking about the racial violence, the violence against African Americans by police in the United States. Eventually that comes back and hits the majority population. That's the boomerang. And so the idea, right, that blacks are much more likely to be killed by the police than are whites, that the police are almost never held accountable. This is material we've covered together before. I'm going pretty quickly because I want to draw out its relevance to what we're talking about today. The idea that, and this is, I think, extraordinarily important, right, that there are proven methods for training the police to reduce violence, especially in their encounters with African Americans and African American motorists, right? Specifically, that when the police are trained to de-escalate or to use alternatives to force and violence, the percentage of people who are harmed goes down dramatically. And we can see this in various examples. After police training, the level of lethal encounters declines dramatically or can be eliminated entirely. But I do want to say, I don't think it was or is this administration's intention to minimize violence. Rather, the intention is the opposite, right? And I'll say this very quickly. The idea that the administration is recruiting ICE officers, right? There's been, right, a quadrupling of the money available to hire ICE officers. They're being hired very quickly, and the recruiting material, right, shows video games in which you do violence to racial minorities as a recruiting device, right? It suggests these recruiting, right, videos that the United States is being invaded, that there's an enemy within, and that what you would be doing in joining ICE is joining the war against the internal enemy, right? They are recruiting for people who are likely to use violence in illegal and unrestrained ways, and then to get them out quickly, which again is part of the strategy to move too quickly for the opposition to resist, but also the strategy to produce the reality that you want to see by bringing it about violently and forcefully that prevents them from training these officers. And then I'll just add very quickly, right? And we're hearing this in various testimonies, that there is a standard protocol for training the ICE officers and other federal law enforcement and Department of Homeland Security officers. And these new recruits are being deployed without that training, with a much more truncated kind of training. But even if they had the full training, and by the way, the man who shot Renee Good, if he's been appropriately identified and if the information is accurate, is actually not a new recruit. He probably does have the appropriate training. The appropriate training does not include the kind of crowd control stuff that, right, is necessary if you're doing operations in the interior of the country that are being protested against. They are trained to do a mission very different from the mission that they're being asked to do by this administration. And so the risks are high. And by the way, this administration has no interest in mitigating or minimizing those risks, as opposed to welcoming them and hoping that it will produce the kinds of images and reality that they want to produce. Now, when we look at J.D. Vance or Kristi Noem's or Donald Trump's reaction to what happened on Wednesday, I think we see them having learned the sad but effective lesson of 2020, which is, right, for a brief moment, there was actually greater trust in the Black Lives Matters protesters and movement than there was in law enforcement in June of 2020 as the image of George Floyd's execution circulated. But, right, very quickly, trust in law enforcement went back up again. Trust in Black Lives Matter went down, right? And in particular, the big, right, change here was among white people's perception. Black people's perception did not change very much. And it appears that it was driven by reporting on Fox News, right? And the idea that Fox News, first of all, right, referred to these as protests, more or less the same degree as other networks, but referred to the protesters as looting and rioting far more often than their competitor networks, and that they showed images. And to be as clear as possible, there was looting and there was rioting, but it was not very typical of these protests, the vast majority of which were peaceful. But those images of violence, of lawlessness, played on a loop on Fox News. And because Fox News is the most watched network in the United States, because those images were also pumped out via social media in the right-wing media ecosystem, very quickly opinion changed. And so the effort to control the images and the narrative surrounding what happened in Minneapolis to Renee Good, I think the administration is fast forwarding and really trying to do this very quickly and to say things about her, right, that again make it really incredible to believe that the Department of Justice will do an honest investigation into what happened, as opposed to this being another propaganda feedback loop. I want to notice for a few minutes that I'll put it blandly. I think that the administration is lying, and is lying deliberately, because they believe that in the 21st century, our public sphere, our media system, the way in which we establish truth, the way in which we convey belief, is so damaged that it's entirely possible for them not to get us, those of us who are inclined to be skeptical of ICE and the Trump administration to begin with, but their followers to believe that what they did in Minneapolis was lawful and appropriate. And we've talked about this together before. I don't want to go into the details today. I'm just putting this on the board to refresh your memory. But that new digital technologies are entering the public sphere and profoundly transforming the technology through which we learn, we think, we deliberate, we transmit beliefs, and that the epistemic standards for content production and distribution, right? The sensitivity to whether or not a claim can be verified as true or not prior to it circulating in the public sphere are being removed, right? And so that this means that increasingly unreliable knowledge circulates as widely or more widely than verifiable knowledge, that this is undermining deliberation, and that this administration welcomes and is accelerating this process. That is the fundamental proposition that I want to think through with you as we move to the close today. I've shown you before, I'll refresh your memory, that there is considerable research that shows that there is an algorithmic amplification in the social media world. Lies and disinformation spread much more rapidly and thoroughly than does truth, and in particular, when the lie is designed to trigger extreme emotions. The algorithm responds to the way in which it captures our attention and promotes its spread to a wider audience. And the result is a kind of cascade of disinformation. Now, I want to notice, right, very quickly, that part of the reason that the truth got out about George Floyd, that I think the truth is getting out about Renee Good, is because there are certain images or certain videos that display truths that also capture and provoke extreme emotions. And it is one of the reasons I believe that there's a good likelihood that there will be big protests around Renee Good's killing. But having said that, I want to note, right, that what matters for who sees what is the structure of the network of communication that a public sphere makes possible. And I've shown you this before, different ways of diagramming different forms of transmission of ideas in terms of networks, and the idea that it is possible to have networked opinion formation that is highly polarized, such that, right, one group hears only from their side and the other group hears only from its side, that the few people who are in touch with the other side do not transmit the beliefs to the rest of the people in the network, or that the networks are totally partitioned, no overlap whatsoever. And that in the United States, there's a lot of literature that this is the kind of public sphere that we have or are evolving in the 21st century, that we have increasingly, right, systems within the media that transmit news, information, belief, narrative, and images on the basis not of their verifiability, their truth, their public relevance, but exclusively on the basis of their ability to confirm the identity, engage the attention, stoke the emotions of those who view it. And that this is, I think, rightly viewed as a propaganda feedback mechanism. It is driving a rapid decline in trust in mainstream media. It is leading to a partitioning, a segregation of our media systems in which we have center and left media ecosystem that is relatively networked and actually tries to police itself for disinformation, and a relatively distinct right-wing media ecosystem that does not police itself for disinformation. And right, we can look at this up close, but I don't think we need to. What we can see is that we have a bifurcated distribution of attention in our media system, right? That there are people who pay attention to, right, the center-left media ecosystem, which tends to be relatively moderate in its ideology, and people who pay more or less exclusive attention to the right-wing media ecosystem, what's sometimes called the Fox News diet, and that the opinion here is distributed on the far or extreme end of the spectrum of ideology. Donald Trump understands this. Donald Trump, I think, viscerally, is someone who relates to the idea that image, attention matter in the 21st century media system. He's someone who has been a deep student of brand and image management and manipulation his whole life, and who intuitively grasps the way in which the new structure of the public sphere permits us to do this, right? And who therefore, I think, might be attracted to the idea of Venezuelan oil enriching the United States, but I think far more important for him is the assertion that the reason that the United States invaded Venezuela and captured its president is because we want the oil. It may not work out. It may all be, right, ultimately totally unworkable. Another bad idea. Bad ideas make bad policies. I've said to you many times, right? But the idea that we say publicly we invaded Venezuela for their oil pulls us back to the 19th century, to the Monroe Doctrine, to the idea that great powers do what they want. And what matters more is that the world understands that this is the way we're acting, because acting in this way produces a world in which we get to act in this way, in which the institutions that we had built that restrain us no longer restrain us. And similarly, right, the idea that Donald Trump is trying to dismantle the rule of law in the United States, is trying to make it possible for a paramilitary organization controlled by him and his administration to execute a citizen on the streets of an American city, and for there to be no legal recourse for it, is part of the production of a new political reality. The image, the act, the deed is what matters. So let me conclude by talking a little bit about this accelerating kind of post-truth politics that I think this week really brings into focus, right? That the first element of this is the dismissal, and I'm sorry, it should say, of standard forms of knowledge generation and propagation as false. And part of, right, what matters here is that experts and expertise, mainstream sources are discredited, right? And so we hear again and again Donald Trump berating the mainstream media, calling it a system of disinformation and lies. We hear, right, him running down expertise and saying, right, that the experts don't know what they're talking about. It's why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is in charge of the Center for Disease Controls. We don't have time to talk about it today, but, right, really important stuff is happening, where RFK is using his judgment and ignoring the judgment of experts. This comes out of the post-COVID environment in which many people think that the medical establishment got important recommendations wrong and restricted their liberty and are generalizing that to a hostility to experts who claim to know better than they do. But it also comes out of this polarized and transformed media environment we belong in, and this new alternative media system in which anybody can publish anything and produce some of the trappings of the authority that comes with publication and of the apparent expertise that is assumed when something is published. But the fundamental stance here, and it is, I'll call it Nietzschean after Friedrich Nietzsche. You could call it maybe nihilistic, fascist, authoritarian, right? It is that power and authority, not knowledge and verifiability, make truth, right? Or at least create the belief in the truth. The deed is more important than the word. What you do is what matters, not what you say. Will and action are at the root to claims to truth, and deliberation and understanding disguise but reflect that priority, right? And so the idea that when we make arguments to each other, right, what we're really doing is merely reflecting a reality that power has made, that the argument is the echo of the act, that this is, I think, right, nihilistic, or at least a worldview that denies that there is verifiable, demonstrable truth, and that deliberation, argumentation, conversation are means via which we discover them. And that the idea that has taken hold, right? This understanding of the world according to which experts argue with each other, and in so doing, through deliberation, through discourse, eventually discover a deeper understanding of the truth, that this is a disease. This is a weakness. This is something that has prevented, right, strong individuals, typically masculine men, from doing what they really have to do to create meaning, to create truth, to impose themselves, to further civilization, and that is to be strong and impose their wills on the world. And that, in a sense, this is an administration peopled, staffed with, right, people who believe this and who are now acting in this way. So will and power produce images and spectacles, which in turn produce new realities and truth. And this is especially the case when it's possible to rely on the amplifying truth in different media ecosystem that we see on Fox, on reality TV, on Twitter, on X, right? And when experts have been discredited, right? And so I hope this is clear, right? That there is an effort to not concede the mistakes of the first year of the second Trump administration, to forge ahead as if Donald Trump is still both popular and powerful and not in any way diminished by his failure to deliver what he promised in the first year of his presidency. Now, the one place that it seems to me Donald Trump might run into problems in this effort to substitute his will, his power, the images and spectacles they create for deliberation, for verifiable knowledge, would be the court system, right? The American legal system has standards of proof, standards of evidence. We treat them still as a deliberative forum, right? The system constitutes deliberative fora where lawyers make arguments, produce experts, produce testimony, produce evidence, and judges weigh that evidence. Very often we get written decisions that account for why one side's evidence was more persuasive or better verified or better argued. And the fact that the Supreme Court is proving so pliant, right, to the Trump administration, and that the corruption of the Department of Justice, the partisan control of it, means that it is no longer governed by the impartial rule of law, I think really is a further consolidation of this turn to post-truth politics in this administration. I'm sorry to say, I think this is what this last week revealed about the direction Donald Trump is moving in 2026. Let me stop there and open it up. Thoughts, questions, things you disagree with, things you want to share. Who wants to start us out? Anne, go ahead. And then Sandy, I see you. Anne, you're still muted right now.
Got it. I've had two thoughts. One is how much within this whole context that you've described, how much of this invasion of Venezuela and threatening Greenland all is included in his inability to deal with domestic life. It's just keep the attention off of how badly I'm doing here, because he has no programs, he has nothing going internally.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then I had one other, just a quick comment. The immediate response of federal people who got up in front of mics and made these horrendous lies about what had simply just happened. And like they believed what they were saying. I mean, I just don't understand people like that. So those are my 2 points. Thank you.
Okay. So one way to view Venezuela is as an effort to distract us from the domestic failure of the policies that have been implemented, especially the tariffs and the deportation, the big beautiful bill, and the way in which they are increasing prices without producing more jobs or better wages. Now it brings us back to what I hope to be speaking with you about next week: affordability, abundance, well-being in the economy. I'll say two things about this, so first, yes, obviously this is an effort to compensate for the failure of policy. And by the way, please note that I think it's incredibly likely that this policy, if invading Venezuela, is more than a spectacle, but in fact a policy that seems to be focused on extracting petroleum and associated revenues from Venezuela, is very likely to fail, and so in the long term, to be another failed policy, and in particular to fail in its domestic ramifications. I believe part of what attracts Trump to this is the thought that oil still is the essential commodity of the economy. I was preparing for you before what happened on Wednesday a long analysis of why I think that worldview is mistaken, confused, nostalgic, and that in fact the future of energy, just if we're focused on energy, is renewables, and that China is cornering the market while we're fighting the last century's wars, or maybe 2 centuries ago's wars, But having said that, if the point is the short-term spectacle, just to distract us for now from how bad things are going domestically, yes, that's one way to see it. But I think it's deeper than that. I think the point is in part to say the old legal constraints internationally, the United Nations, the principle of territorial sovereignty and integrity, the immunity of heads of states from these kinds of actions don't apply anymore. We're making a new world in which the powerful do what the powerful want to do. It's a return to the realism or the Machtpolitik of the 19th century, the imperial era. But I think it's also then meant to convey something more domestically as well. Don't think that the failure of the domestic policies of the president are going to weaken him, because he still has all of this capacity for violence, all of this power, and he can use it domestically or internationally, and no one's stopping him, right? So don't be emboldened if you're a Trump critic, or if you're a Republican who maybe just for strategic reasons now wants to distance yourself from this president. This president still has an arsenal, and he can come for you. Now, Anne, your second question was about Kristi Noem or J.D. Vance or Donald Trump, right? Getting up and prejudging what happened, right? And without evidence, and then in ways that contradict the clear evidence of the videos that were taken, asserting that Renee Good was, right, trying to ram the law enforcement agent with her car, right? And note the difference, right, between saying the law enforcement agent perceived himself to be a threat, right, to be threatened by her, and saying she was actually doing this, right? It's just, on the one hand, clearly irresponsible for people who are supposed to be involved in supervising an agency and making sure that the people who work for that agency are abiding by the law and the norms of the agency, to immediately come to the defense of the agency, right? Or the particular, I should say, actor involved, right? It leads to this skepticism that there's going to be any kind of honest inquiry into this. But I want to, again, pivot to the deeper point, which is I don't think that they think there is such a thing as truth, or that they are restrained by it. There's this literature by Harry Frankfurt of Princeton University. The book is called Unbullshit, and it sponsored a lot of philosophical debate about what a bullshitter is, right? And that a bullshitter is somebody who is truth indifferent, who says, right, there may be truth, but I don't care. I'm going to say what I think serves my interests, or how I want the world to be. I'll describe it in that way, and maybe I can even produce the world that I want there to be, or the perception that the world is the way I want it to be, by, right, asserting that the world is that way, if I'm powerful enough, if I'm dogged enough in my assertions. And that this is the world in which Donald Trump operates, and he has generalized this stance to the truth, or this post-truth politics, as I'm calling it, across his administration. It seems to be one of the qualifications of being part of the administration. It's why so many people of the administration come out of the Fox News universe. I believe there are 30 people in the administration who come out of Fox News, and this is, right, the post-truth propaganda network. And so I want to say, yes, from where I stand, I see what they're doing as lying and as deeply irresponsible, given that they're supposed to be in charge of figuring out what actually happened in order to discipline people who may have violated the law or the rules and norms of their agency. But I think from their perspective, this is just what everyone does. Everybody is spinning all the time and trying to bring the reality that they want to see into being just by asserting it so. And so they think what I'm doing right now is every bit of as much a lie as what they're doing, right? And that is the deep, what I'm calling nihilism of this perspective. I do believe this is true of Donald Trump, and I do believe he increasingly has imposed this stance to the truth on everybody else in his administration. All right, Sandy, thank you for waiting. Go ahead. While you do, I'm going to plug in so my computer doesn't die. What do you got to say, Sandy?
Mine's pretty much on the same point. I'm a little bit worried, or I should say I'm very worried about how we can continue to access truth. I just heard that PBS lost its weekend funding, and
I'm sorry, Sandy, say it again, that PBS what?
Has lost its weekend funding. They'll no longer be on weekend. So as there's pressure to eliminate the independent news sources, I'm very worried about how we will access truth.
Yeah, and so I'll go back for a second. I'm looking up the PBS funding question because I hadn't heard that, and I'm wondering, right? PBS is the entire network. If it's true, oh, I see. The news weekend
Yes.
is ending, right?
Yes.
So it's a particular show that is ending. Yes, and I do expect that this will be the case, that there will be particular stations and particular shows that will close down, and that it will be particularly hard on rural areas. Let me just show you for a moment in my slides. By the way, let me say this very quickly. Last week, I gave my entire class thinking I was sharing slides with you. And then I went to the recording and I wasn't sharing slides with you. I was sharing something different from what I was sharing. If that ever happens again, right? And in this instance, I was looking at what I saw on my computer and it looked like I was sharing my slides with you. And in fact, I wasn't. Please let me know so that I can correct. But you're seeing the slide now, I hope, public sphere as central and vulnerable institution of modern democracy. And on the right side of the slide, I didn't dwell on it, is all the PBS and NPR stations that are at risk now that the federal government no longer funds the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And I suppose you know that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has gone out of business, has dissolved itself in light of the lack of funding. And so please note, that these are areas where NPR and PBS stations are going to close altogether. They're almost all rural areas, In the urban areas, the contributions from the viewers and listeners are sufficient to sustain the operations. But this is going to create a world in which more and more people are going to get their news from social media or from Fox as a result, So yes, I do think that we should be worried that the public sphere, the media system is fragile and declining in the moment that we live in. And that, by the way, this is part of what enables this post-truth stance of this administration, part of why they're emboldened to think that they will be able to change the world by generating the image of the world, the spectacle of a new world, without having to debate it, without having to argue about it, without having to worry about legal accountability for having done things that are illegal to do so. So yeah, I share exactly that concern, Sandy. David, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I listen to this conversation and I say to myself, what we have here is a moral, ethical, and epistemological crisis, which makes it both a cultural problem, that is, what kinds of values are we instilling in those in our children as they grow up, and an educational problem where somehow kids are getting out of school not understanding the costs and benefits of different views of what knowledge is and what truth is and the like. And I guess I wonder just how much we've abandoned any sort of effort in our educational systems, as well as other cultural phenomena like, I guess, family and church and things like that, to address these issues. Because I just think that we don't have the intellectual and moral and ethical um, uh, gumption to stand up to someone who believes that lying is perfectly legitimate if it serves the function of increasing your power. So,
Yeah, and so obviously there's a battle being waged right now for the control of curricula at public schools, right? And not just at the elementary schools or the high schools, but also at universities and not exclusively at public universities, right? And so yes, the degree of politicization of knowledge production that's occurring, as well as politicization of knowledge transmission and the preparation of future citizens through education. It's all part and parcel of this larger battle. But I want to say one more thing, David, and so I'm a little skeptical of the idea that by themselves the schools can produce media literacy or informed citizenship. And so there's a lot of studies of civic education, right? Of learning history, but learning, right, the habits of effective citizenship, learning about, voting and the related ways of participating in politics. And the literature finds mainly that whatever you teach students, they don't remember it a year or two or three, let alone 10 or 20 years later, right? And it's a little humbling and frustrating for lifelong educators to hear that, but I think we do have to reckon with it. I do think we have to take it seriously. And then I would suggest that when right various forms of civic education seem to work is when it's not just something you learn in school. I
right.
used this example before, right? How much of your trigonometry from 10th grade do you remember? Right? And if you don't use it, if you're not a civil engineer or someone for whom it matters, probably not very much, right? Because it's something you learned once. And what Dewey and others taught us about education is if you don't use the knowledge, you lose the knowledge pretty quickly, right? And so for civic education to be effective, it has to be part of our culture, part of our practice, useful to us in daily life. And so here, I have been doing some writing on this. It seems to me that the right model for thinking about how to produce media literacy and how to preserve some sort of deliberative public sphere that continues to have a minimum epistemological value that helps us to sort what is true from what is false, right? Is something akin to a public health approach, right? Where we really don't just say you're going to learn about this in school for a year or two, for an hour or two a day, right? But you're going to get it from multiple different angles from people who you maybe pay more attention to than your teachers. And so looking, for instance, at the way in which the public health campaign around smoking convinced people to stop smoking, not just lectured at them in a classroom, but managed to make it part of the common culture, that this was something that we need to do, I think is the more effective model. But having said that, I don't think that's where we're headed today, right? We're headed in the opposite direction for the next couple years. And so then I also look at the civil rights movement or other movements that are, right, originally civil society social movements. And here I think, again, that we've got to be thinking about, among other things, not just how we organize ourselves, how we effectively organize to shift the narrative about what's happening in our society, but how in this new and difficult environment, we begin to reach out to the other side. We begin to be able to say things that they recognize, hear them, understand them, that in some sense are responsive to their concerns. And so, right, that involves not just dismissing them as post-truth or lying, which I think is fine to do to Trump, but not to do to Trump's supporters or followers, as long as they're not, right, totally irredeemable racists, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I completely agree with you, which is why I characterize it not only as an educational, but as a cultural problem. And it seems to me that the cultural side of things requires a much broader approach to rectifying the situation that involves many institutions and involves the kind of things that David Brooks is always talking about having this be, a sort of a cultural change in our society and making it clear that it's not just one small group doing it. And I completely also agree with you about the idea of reaching out to the other side. I think the insularity of our current situation, where we only talk to people who think just like us, is a big part of the problem. And we no longer seem to be able to talk to people and air disagreements without attributing, the worst of all possible motives to the person who disagrees with us. And until that changes, I think it's just a matter of changing who has the power from one, administration to the next. So.
And you mentioning David Brooks puts me in mind of something else that he often emphasizes, which is character and identity formation. And so I do think that part of the problem we have in the 21st century is that partisan identity has become this all-encompassing identity, right? And that in a different world, an earlier world, many people thought, well, I'm with my party so long as my party is in the right, but that I have to make up my own mind, and that it's extremely important to who I am, to my ability to respect myself, that I don't follow my party when it's wrong, and that I do exercise independent judgment, and that we seem to have lost track of this, right, essential component of self-respect, that we think for ourselves, that we reason about the evidence, that we not simply follow our tribe where it takes us, right? And that this is another dimension. I'll say one more thing, because today has been so dark in many ways, and I think it's a dark beginning to what could be a bright year. It's a year in which, on the one hand, we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the birth of the country, and on the other hand, we look forward to elections at the end of the year as a way of exercising the power that revolution gave us. But having said all that, let me just note, right, that very often the way in which we move forward is not directly because we learn, but through pendulum swings, because we have to confront something dark and bad in order to learn how to resist it or overcome it. So maybe this is a necessary step to figuring out how to master this media, how to get to politics in the 21st century that is a bit more responsive. You put it nicely, David, when you tied ethics and epistemology together. Hannah, I see you've got your hand up. I'm going to let you have the last question or comment for today. Go ahead.
I just had a comment from Thursday's, what's it called? The Financial Times.
Yes.
That you choose a team for rational reasons. It's local, it's winning, it matches your political beliefs, whatever. However, later on, the attachment becomes self-reinforcing. Almost you tend to not pay any attention to whether they're winning, they're losing, they're anything. It's your team. And I think that we are facing that in this country, and we are attempting to counter it with logic, with facts, and that is not going to be effective.
Hannah, you're making a good and serious point. Can I respond with a little bit of humor? Are you talking about the Warriors or the 49ers? Yeah. All right, everybody. Nice to be able to leave you maybe on a little bit of a lighter note. Go Niners, and see everybody next week. Thank you, guys. Good to be with you as always. Take care and see you soon. Oh, by the way, I'll be there on the 31st, the last Saturday of January, to see you in person. Looking forward to that as well. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye, guys.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you. Bye-bye.